Es geht durch die Welt ein Geflüster. Arbeiter, hörst du es nicht? Das sind die Stimmen der Kriegsminister. Arbeiter, hörst du sie nicht? Es flüstern die Kohle- und Stahlproduzenten. Es flüstert die chemische Kriegsproduktion. Es flüstert von allen Kontinenten. Mobilmachung gegen die Sowjetunion. Arbeiter rauchen, nehmt die Gewehre zur Hand. Zerschlag die Faschisten,
Conversations about Marxism and Marxist theory tend to center around the political and economic critiques which it levies at capitalism class society more generally. However, before a conversation regarding Marxist critique can even happen, we have to have a decent grasp of the way in which Marxism generally conceives of political economy. That is, we need to understand the way in which Marxism interprets and understands the structure of society internally. So in this video, I'm going to explain the basics of two very essential concepts in Marxist theory, that is, the base and the ideological superstructure, and how these concepts are related structurally within Marxist theory. On the Marxist account, all class societies can be broken down into a structure composed of two essential parts, that is, the economic base and the ideological superstructure. So I'll explain what each of these means in turn. The economic base, which functions as the essential platform and basis for the rest of society, is made up of the different components of the economic structure of society. As such, the economic base is composed of productive forces, first of all, and social relations, second of all. The productive forces, to clarify, are the pieces of technology, machinery, tools, raw materials, and the like that are used in the process of production. In the context of capitalism, for example, productive machines, trains, mines, and the like are all forms of productive forces, also commonly known as the means of production. Social relations, on the other hand, are the class and general economic relationships that one must enter into during the process of production. Class relations are a very prevalent example historically of these sorts of social relations. So, a social relation under capitalism, for example, would be the relationship between a proletarian and their capitalist boss. And that is a relationship under capitalism that one must enter into in order to engage in the process of production, mainly because capitalists have hegemonic control over the productive forces. In other words, the productive forces are what production is done with, while social relations are how production is arranged and done. Thus, those things and processes which are included in the economic base are things such as class, property relations, means of production, and the like. The other component of society on the Marxist account is the ideological superstructure. Whereas the economic base is composed primarily of material objects and things such as machines, the superstructure is composed of ideas, norms, and relationships. As such, the ideological superstructure is the set of ideas and relations regarding morality, politics, religion, and the like which define a particular historical period. The most defining part of the ideological superstructure in the development of capitalism, for example, has been the ideology of liberalism, which arose during the initial conflict between the bourgeoisie and the feudal order. That is, liberalism was the ideology of the capitalists. However, ideology can also infiltrate very commonplace things such as film, art, and other forms of culture, hence why you can see forms of ideology within films that are made by Hollywood, for example. It is also important to note that the ideological superstructure is not formed arbitrarily or randomly through the arrangements of the economic base. Rather, it is formed to serve very particular class interests present within the base. Under capitalism, for example, culture and ideology serve primarily to reproduce and justify the capitalist system, along with the general interests of the bourgeoisie to those that it oppresses. Hence why in countries like the United States, where imperialism is very dominant, ideology can cross class borders, with proletarians believing very bourgeois ideologies like racism, sexism, and liberalism. In Engels' terms, the system must perpetually reproduce itself lest it be conquered by the revolutionary class of the era. There are several points to be made given this understanding of the structural constitution of society, and I will finish the video once I explain these pieces of analysis. First of all, the base and superstructure do not exist as isolated from one another. Rather, they have a very causal relationship to one another. In common Marxist phraseology, the base determines the superstructure. This means that the arrangement of production and the level of advancement of the productive forces, that is the base, will cause certain changes in the ideological superstructure though the nature of this change is questionable, and oftentimes Marxists will disagree how mechanical it is. This explains why, however, we see such radical changes in ideology and representation at the superstructural level and ideological level whenever there are similar radical changes in the economic constitution of society at the level of the base. So, for example, during the shift from feudalism to capitalism, we saw very radical changes not only in the economic relationships which were defining and altering society, but also the way in which the state was represented, the way in which ideology was represented, and the way in which religion was represented within society. Second, the ideological superstructure, while predominantly composed of ideas, also contains political formations which exist within each historical period. This explains very well why the form of the political machinery of the state changes very radically with each successive historical period and era. For example, in the context of early capitalist hegemony, states shifted from being incredibly decentralized and regional, as they were under feudalism, to being extremely large and centralized due to the high demand of capitalists within states for legal systems to be relatively uniform for the sake of speculation and trade over large distances and across markets. This also explains within Marxist theory why altering economic arrangements during a socialist revolution would change the character of the state from one that oppresses the majority of people on the planet to one that represents the masses and oppresses the capitalists and imperialists on behalf of the masses. And third and finally, ideology within the superstructure, though it serves class interests, does not solely represent or reproduce the ideas and interests of the ruling class. For example, under capitalism, although ideology tends to support the interests of capitalists, it also represents the interests of other classes and can also represent interests that are even antagonistic to capitalists. Later in Marx's work, he explains that ideology is the result of the ongoing battle constantly occurring between the ruling class and the subordinate classes, rather than simply the ruling class. As such, ideology not only contains elements from a large number of different classes, but also changes its character over time. For example, depending upon the state of the struggle between capitalists and proletarians at a given point in time, general ideology may take on a particularly bourgeois character or a particularly proletarian character. This is because the economic arrangements and contradictions which occur at the level of the base will determine the representations present in the ideological superstructure and the political superstructure. I'll go more in depth in this in a future video when I cover a later Marxist theorist known as Gramsci, who theorized more in depth what exactly ideology looks like within the Marxist framework.